Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's online office hour, introducing what's new in Alluxio 2.5. My name is Amelia, and I will be your moderator. Before I introduce you to our speaker, I just have a few housekeeping items. All participants are automatically on mute throughout the session, and we will be using Slack for Q&A. We invite you to engage with us and the open source community on Slack, so please take a moment to join us on the community Slack channel, which is also copied into the GoToWebinar chat box. You can find it at alluxio.io/Slack. However, if you are having trouble joining Slack, feel free to message me your questions instead via the GoToWebinar control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. In today's session, you will first hear from our speaker, and then we will have a Q&A at the end so we can answer all of your questions. Again, to ask a question, you're welcome to either join the community Slack channel or don't hesitate to send in your questions anytime via the GoToWebinar control panel. Lastly, today's session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand playback. We will email you the link to the presentation as well. So that's it on the housekeeping side. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Calvin Jia, who is the founding engineer of Alluxio, as well as head of architect. And he will talk more about what's exciting in the latest release in Alluxio 2.5. So passing it on to you, Calvin.
All right, thanks, Amelia. Welcome everyone again to today's office hour. This is an office hour, so I really encourage you guys to ask questions, kind of just be, we can chat about anything not necessarily related to today's main topic, which is what's new in Alluxio 2.5. But first, I'll go over kind of in this release where we were thinking in terms of developing the Alluxio project, as well as kind of what our community and our users have been using the newer release for. Okay, so first kind of just a high level overview of what the focus areas were for the 2.5 release. The first was around supporting different interfaces. So as you guys probably know, Alluxio is working really well for Hadoop-based workloads, and that's through generally the HDFS API. And that supports a lot of workloads like OLAP and traditional batch processing. For example, if you're using Presto or if you're using Spark. However, Alluxio is a lot more than that. As kind of a data orchestration layer, there's all kinds of different interfaces that we have our applications want to use. So two very important interfaces that we've kind of seen usage in the community are Alluxio Fuse, which is just like a POSIX API that kind of can act as if it was a local file system. And then also the S3 API, which S3, you generally think of it as more of a archival or cold storage type of API, but we've actually noticed a lot of our users wanting to use S3 because that's kind of what works best for their administrators. They just want to take a look at what's in the file system, maybe make a few modifications like delete a file or upload their own files. And then the other focus area that we had was around the cloud native integrations. So cloud is kind of a really big part of the Alluxio project. We see more and more users wanting to deploy Alluxio in the cloud or in the hybrid cloud situation. And in order to best serve kind of these cloud-based workloads, we have integrations with their various storage systems and other kind of security components in the cloud. So in 2.5, we added three things. One is a connector for ADLS, which is the Azure Data Lake. And another is kind of an updated Google Cloud Storage connector, which leverages their own SDK and has the latest optimizations. And then finally, also integration with Amazon's secure token service so that users are able to use one unified security model when connecting to S3. Okay, now I'm going to go into a bit more detail for some of these features. So first is around kind of the improved POSIX API through our Fuse interface. So what did we actually do? Before we had an interface called JNR Fuse, and that was based off of the JNR Fuse library. And that had a few different limitations, as well as kind of the code base was not maintained very often, or it didn't have the latest improvements, for example, for the Fuse 3. So what we did was we introduced a new JNI-based Fuse integration that's kind of developed by our community members, as well as part of like the Alluxio code base itself. So there we can leverage the most up-to-date kind of improvements in the integration, as well as make it work specifically for Alluxio's use case. And by doing this, we saw about 3 to 5 times performance improvement for a lot of workloads in the AI and ML training area that leverage high concurrency. So this generally is not going to impact you if, for example, you're just using Fuse as like a convenience for your own local file system. But if you're running something like TensorFlow or PyTorch and you're running a pretty high load on like GPUs or using CPUs for training, but like with lots of parallelism, you're going to be able to see a huge performance difference when using the newer JNI-based integration. So the other API we improved was the S3 northbound API. So here, we've had the S3 northbound API for a while, but in this release, we kind of did a bunch of updates as well as kind of a version compatibility changes so that it can work with the kind of standard S3 browsers that you guys would find kind of in open source or even like kind of proprietary S3 browsers. And one example that we focused on was just called S3 browser. Has a very, I guess, descriptive name. But basically, once you have one of these kind of client-side browsers, generally they ask for some kind of URI to connect to your S3 bucket. Normally, you're putting something like a S3 path there, but in the case where you want to use Alluxio's northbound S3 API, you would just put the kind of the host name of the Alluxio proxy service that you're running, and then it'll basically connect to it as if it was an S3 bucket itself. And then you can see on the right-hand side, you would be able to see kind of the layout of the overall file system in kind of S3's bucket format. And you would be able to do various things like download or upload files, or maybe even change the permissions. And this is all of this will go like through a REST interface to the Alluxio proxy. So you don't need anything special on those machines, meaning you could actually even run this, for example, on like Windows or something like that, that doesn't actually have like a native client support. So then onto the cloud storage integrations. These are a bit more straightforward. The ADLS Gen 2 connector is just a connector that lets you connect to the Azure Data Lake storage. And the main benefit of this is Azure, they have a few different storage systems. The most basic one is the Azure Blob Store, which we previously integrated with. But the ADLS Gen 2 kind of storage, it allows you to get a few more optimizations. It has a namespace on top of the object store, so you're able to make a few more, I guess, optimal calls. For example, when you're renaming or when you're listing the various files. And in general, that will be kind of the default way Azure recommends you run your big data applications on. For the native GCS connector, we're mostly upgrading from our old integration, which was with an open source project, to Google's kind of own published SDK. This provides a few benefits. The main one is kind of integration with their newest security kind of best practices. This has been changing a bit rapidly, and some of the open source tools haven't been able to keep up with their API changes. But with the kind of the native SDK, it obviously supports everything that Google has to offer. It's also a bit more, I would say, optimal in terms of the various APIs used and kind of some of the thread management that it uses in the background. So you might see a bit of a performance gain as well when you're using a lot of parallelism. And then the final integration we had was with AWS. So AWS's kind of security model generally wants users to have no permissions, and then afterwards, users are only able to kind of upgrade themselves to take a role. And once they take this role has permissions. But the good part about this model is you kind of take this role for only a short period of time. Meaning if someone is able to get access to your credentials, they're still not able to have long-term access to your like storage or any of your other AWS services. So in order to kind of support this model in Alluxio, we've integrated with Amazon's secure token service, which is responsible for giving us these tokens in order for Alluxio to assume all of these different roles in order to eventually access S3. What this means is kind of the credentials that the Alluxio system is using in order to access S3 are changing over time. So you'll have a lot more kind of security in the case where you need to either revoke the privileges or if you want to rotate those keys because they may have been compromised. And then in the background, Alluxio is doing all of this for you, so you don't need to manually, like, for example, restart the system with the new credentials or anything like that. Okay, one other thing we didn't talk too much about was Alluxio on Kubernetes. So we talked a lot about kind of the integrations with the cloud service providers, but Kubernetes is also a huge kind of deployment platform that we see a lot of our community users on. And kind of the benefits of Kubernetes is you can kind of integrate with Kubernetes, get Alluxio running on Kubernetes, and then you can kind of port that wherever you want, as long as you have a Kubernetes kind of deployment running. So for example, if you were on-prem and you're running with Kubernetes there, and one day you decide, hey, I want to try out Amazon, then you could use like Amazon's Kubernetes service, I think it's called AKS, and then you would be able to kind of not need to change anything and just run on their managed Kubernetes service without having to reconfigure or even deploy various services in Amazon. And then like say you use Amazon for a while and you're like, okay, this isn't quite the best cloud. I want to use like Azure or I want to use Google. Like you can just use those Kubernetes services, and again, you would be able to transfer kind of your processes over without having to reintegrate. So that's kind of why you might want to use Kubernetes. And for Kubernetes, we've made a few improvements in 2.5. First is kind of around our data orchestration hub, which is our managed deployment tool that can be used to launch clusters in various environments. We now support Kubernetes as one of those environments. If you're just getting started using Alluxio, I would really encourage using the data orchestration hub as kind of your starting point, because it'll make a lot of the management and setup a lot easier. We've also added the remote logger on Kubernetes, which means that you'll be able to kind of send any logs from one machine to a central server in order to kind of collect that information later for debugging or auditing purposes. The benefit of this is Kubernetes is kind of known for letting those machines be pretty, I guess, expendable. So sometimes your machines, like pods, will go up and down without notice, and then you'll lose kind of those logs that you previously had on those machines. With a remote logger system, you can actually just send them all to like a central node, which you can have more like uptime guarantees on. We've also made some improvements around the metric system in order to kind of just be able to gather stats like you would normally with the Alluxio system. And then also in the Docker image itself, we've added kind of more detailed logging around like the JVM process itself with both the async profiler and a open source tool called Arthas. And then lastly, I wanted to kind of point to some of the use cases our community has published around using the new Fuse integration. One is through Azure ML, and they are able to achieve really great results running some deep learning workloads on top of Alluxio. And then another one is from Alibaba, which kind of showcases how they were able to do efficient model training with a variety of technologies in their cloud. Kind of their recommended stack was TensorFlow on top of Alluxio deployed on Kubernetes. Okay, yeah, that was kind of the high-level overview of Alluxio 2.5, and we've had a lot of exciting kind of new features in 2.5, and I really would encourage you guys to try it out if, for example, you are running AI or ML workloads, or if you wanted some better kind of integrations with your cloud storages if you're using something like Google or Amazon. Now, if you guys had like questions about the presentation, I'm happy to answer those, as well as if you just have general Alluxio questions. This is an office hour, so feel free to ask those as well.
Thank you, Calvin. Great. Here we have our first question. Should I continue to use JNR Fuse or switch to JNI?
Okay, that's a good question. So with JNR Fuse, that was like the older integration, and if you're using JNR Fuse now and like everything is working well, you may be tempted to kind of just stay on JNR Fuse, but I would encourage trying to switch over, or at least trying out the new JNI Fuse, because for the purposes of like future developments, we're only going to focus on JNI Fuse unless there's like some like critical bug that we need to fix on the JNI side. But like kind of going forward, that's what we'll be focusing on, and that's where a lot of our community members have moved to as well.
Great, and I see some more questions coming in here. Our next question is, can I use the S3 API to run big data applications like Vertica?
Okay, so the big data applications like through the S3 interface isn't going to be well supported, I would say. Right now, our target use case is just for kind of administrator access and kind of things like browsing. If you wanted to integrate something like Vertica or like another big data application that has kind of an S3 compatible interface, I would encourage first looking at whether or not they support, for example, an HDFS interface. That's generally going to be our more performance interface. But there's no, like in theory, there's no reason why it wouldn't work. It's just, I think there's going to be some limitations around the performance because that's not what we designed that interface for.
All right, and here we have our next question. What's the difference between the native GCS connector and the existing one?
Oh, good question. We've already had like a Google Storage connector for like many releases, but that one actually is kind of the same connector we used to use for Amazon before we switched over to Amazon's native kind of connector. And the main difference would be around like supportability for the newer features. So I believe the old like Google connector kind of hasn't been updated in a while, and generally it works for like kind of normal data access, but the newer like security kind of login methods and things like that won't be supported in the older connector. So I would encourage switching over to the newer Google connector if possible.
All right, that looks like all the questions thus far from the audience. Calvin, is there anything you'd like to add or anything else you'd like to point folks to?
No, I think that's all I had. If you guys do have further questions, feel free to like send a message on Slack. I'm pretty active there, as well as a lot of our other core like maintainers will be there to help you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Calvin, for a great session. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us. And with this, we conclude today's office hour. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next one.